There's definitely cases, the big one the past 6 months was HashiCorp, right? I mean, HashiCorp relicensed to BSL and blew up. It blew up because they had built this really vibrant community. So there was a sense of betrayal, right? There's a sense of a rug pull.
I think the frame of reference with some of this stuff is also really important too, where, if you say we're really committed to this very particular thing and we're going to take one step to the right of it, saying that we're doubling down on that thing, open source, versus we were having to make a decision between moving to a fully closed source proprietary thing, and this was the best set of compromises that we came up with. The exact same action, very different framing.
My philosophy is that open source has become, kind of ubiquitous with a lot of software development because there's a lot of great stuff about it. But it is not necessarily for every project. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Hacking Open Source Business podcast. I'm one of the co-hosts, Matt Yonkovit, joined again by Avi Press from Scarf.
Hello.
And today we have a special guest, Chad Whitacre from Sentry, the head of open source at Sentry. Hi, Chad.
Hello,
how are you doing?
Hello. Good. Thanks for having me.
So, Chad, where are you located? Just out of curiosity.
I am located outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
USA Earth.
All right, fair. Well, there we go. That's great. That's wonderful.
Specific enough?
Yes, specific enough.
Good.
So, you're the head of open source at Sentry. What does the head of open source mean at Sentry? Just give us maybe a little background about your role, because that title is used in a lot of different places for a lot of different things.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Sure. So, head of open source at Sentry. So, I run our open source program office, or OSPO. Which I think by now is fairly common. A lot of the larger companies have OSPOs. And at Sentry, we're about 350 people, so a little on the small side for companies that do have OSPOs. But the thing about Sentry is that open source is core to our company culture. We can get into some of the history, but Sentry started life as an open source kind of side project, and open source is really important to us. So my role as head of open source, I run the OSPO. OSPO is a tiny team. I have 2 engineers that work with me in our OSPO, but we work with every other part of the company. So again, open source is core to Sentry's company culture. And so, yes, we've got kind of dotted lines to every other department in the company, basically. Does that start to give you some sense of it?
Yeah. And Sentry itself does monitoring, and maybe give us the overview of Sentry.
Sure. Yeah. So Sentry is an application monitoring company. Started out with error tracking and put out a performance product a few years ago. And we do crons and replays and things like this. So yeah, it's an application monitoring company, really focused on developers. Our target audience is developers. We're developers. We build for developers. Queue up Steve Ballmer, developers. That's us focused on it. Yes, thank you. Obviously. So application monitoring for developers.
Okay. Go ahead, Avi.
Oh, okay.
You're starting to talk.
Yeah. So I think, one of the main reasons that we're so excited to talk to you today is because recently Sentry made a lot of news in the open source world generally with the introduction of a brand new license.
Yes.
I think that's kind of, the meat and potatoes that we wanted to get into today. And so maybe we can just kick it off with, if you want to just start by, just really quick summary for those that don't know about what the FSL is, and then we can dive into more discussion for those that are more familiar. Sure.
So I'll go ahead and bring up on our screen share if we want to bring it in at some point. This is the homepage for the FSL. So fsl.software is where you can learn more about this. The FSL stands for Functional Source License, and it's a mostly permissive non-compete license that converts to Apache or MIT after 2 years. So the goal with this license is really to balance user freedom and developer sustainability. With open source and kind of pure open source licenses, the chief value is freedom, software freedom, user freedom for software. And what we've learned over the years is that value can sometimes be in tension with developer sustainability. So our goal with the FSL is to put out a license that says, hey, we love open source. We use open source. We live and breathe open source. again, we can get into some of the history, but Sentry started life as an open source side project and lived that way for years before we started building a company around it. So the FSL is kind of our attempt to start to there's been a lot of attempts at this to kind of balance user freedom and developer sustainability. This is kind of our offer or our attempt at this. Maybe I don't know if the immediate predecessor to this is the business source license. I don't know if that's where you want to go next, but in terms of the FSL, the functional source license, and it's designed to balance user freedom and developer sustainability.
Yeah, let's go back because you mentioned this, and I want to kind of walk through the timeline. So,
sure.
Sentry started off as a BSD project.
Well, if you want the timeline, we actually, because I did this history, you can decide if you want this on the screen share or not, but I got to dig back in and find the details because
this is great.
Open source values. Here's this blog post about open source values. And here it is. David Kramer first published Sentry in 2008 as a non-commercial public licenseless side project. So when he first published it, there was no license on it. It was sort of this era of like freewheeling. Here's like the first era of kind of open source pioneers is sort of like, further along in their career. There's like the second generation that's coming along that doesn't maybe have all of the immediate knowledge of kind of the licensing battles that we went through with Microsoft in the very late 90s and things like this. And, it's the era of GitHub just getting started. 2008 is very early GitHub. And, there's this concept of like, what is it called? I'm going to click through on this to remind myself. Oh yeah. Post open source software, F the license and governance, just commit to GitHub. This kind of like freewheeling, just put the code out there. We're like, I don't have time to think about licensing. I'm hacking too much, and just like putting code out there. So that's really where Sentry started, was just, of course I'm going to post the code up there because that's what we do. It wasn't until a year later that, projects started to get some traction. That's when David put BSD license on it. Yes. It's BSD, and it was BSD for years. And then, again, as a side project, then the timeline is 2012 started to commercialize. So 2008, 70 line Django plugin, license list, 2009 BSD, 2012, Heroku plugin. Okay. Remember Heroku?
Okay. Oh yeah.
Yehuda Katz is bringing Heroku back. I just learned, which I'm excited to see. So Heroku plugin 2012, first kind of testing the waters of commercialization. 2015, so another 3 years before David and Chris, our two co-founders, raised some seed money, some venture capital, and started hiring folks. So that was 2015. Yeah, and so it's been kind of a more traditional kind of startup story since then.
Okay, and it was 2019 that the company shifted to the BSL.
Yes, correct.
And so what was kind of the motivation for that? Like at the time, BSL had just started to kind of like, come out. MariaDB really was the driver around BSL. Yep. We saw other folks kind of like follow suit. Mongo did their SSPL shortly thereafter. I mean, there was a lot of movement around the different licenses. But from a Sentry perspective, what kind of drove you all to go from that BSD kind of license to BSL?
Yeah. So I should caveat here. I've been at Sentry for a little over 3 years. Okay. So I was not around specifically for this. But yeah, I can definitely speak to it. So 2019 then, right, we relicensed from BSD to BSL. And maybe, if viewers, listeners are maybe a little bit on kind of the details of the BSL might be helpful. It's what we call an eventual open source license. So the core idea of the BSL is, hey, I put this code out here, and in 4 years, this code is going to be Apache 2 or MIT or some OSD approved license. Until then, you can do everything you want with it except compete with me. Okay, because I'm the producer of the software. My company is the producer of the software. Our company, we want to, protect our viability, our ability to continue growing as a company and continue producing the software. So for 4 years, we get exclusive rights to commercialize the software, and then after 4 years, one of the terms for it is a springing license. So it's not just a promise that you can renege on, but it's kind of baked in that we're granting you a license that 4 years from now you can use this under Apache. Okay, so that's the fundamental shape of the BSL. And the reason that it was compelling to Sentry is that we were starting to get big enough as a company that we were seeing other actors, other companies, kind of eye up our product, the Sentry product, and there was nothing, in the licensing preventing other companies from offering hosting for Sentry, which is how we make our money. We make our money as a SaaS company. And with a BSD license on Sentry's core product, imagine your nearest cloud provider could offer Sentry as one of a number of products that exist in their catalog, and undercut us on price because they don't have to pay for it. They don't have to pay for the development of it. They don't have to bear. So sorry to wrap this up. Am I answering your question, Matt? So it was really that really existential risk to the business, that like any one of these much larger players could totally eat our lunch. That was the risk that we were looking to mitigate with BSL.
So that was a risk the whole time, right? So I'm curious, what was in particular going on that, like, why then? Why at that point in time versus sometime earlier? Were there very specific things that were going on that was causing this, or was this just a general conversation that was ongoing and then kind of came to a head, or what was that like?
So again, I wasn't actually.
Yeah, I know you weren't there at the time.
This was happening, right? But what I can share here is this link to our old forum. This forum's kind of read only now, but this is our discourse forum thread about the relicensing in 2019. Let me bring this up. Move. And what I want to point out is, a lot here on YBSL. This is what's fun. Okay. Ken C. Johnston, hi Sentry team, exciting news. I'm the director of product management at GitLab. Okay. And I cover our ops section. Are we considered an APM provider for the purposes of your license? Is our integration considered use? And then here's David, the founder of Sentry, replying, unfortunately, that is the kind of thing we're trying to prevent. If GitLab's bundling Sentry for its customers, how are we going to fund? Who's going to fund the development of Sentry? So I guess I'm answering your question with a specific example that's public here as one example of a use that we were trying to prevent. I don't know. I thought that was interesting when I found this. It's like, okay, here it is. Here's GitLab saying, "Hey, we were bundling Sentry," and David saying, "Yeah, that's what we're looking to have a conversation."
And was it that type of relationship? And then you were running into this probably more than this. This is a good example of that, but where you've got maybe. And I'll just use some numbers. Like you might have 1,000 customers that are paying you, but then another company like GitLab has 50,000 that all of a sudden use Sentry, and then you see nothing from it.
Yeah, exactly. GitLab, AWS, Google, like the cloud providers. Yeah, that's the sort of company that was kind of threatening us.
Now, what I find
explicitly or implicitly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
What I find funny about this is, like I do hear from companies who do like, hey, we've embedded, but we give back to the community, and maybe they'll throw some patches out there. Or I've even seen some of them like, look, we donated like $10,000, right, like or something to the project, and it ends up being kind of like a very small component.
That's it,
right? Of the overall thing, and it's interesting to see how that's positioned.
Yeah. So it is interesting because there's definitely cases, the big one the past 6 months was HashiCorp, right? I mean, HashiCorp relicensed to BSL and blew up. It blew up because they had built this really vibrant community of, value-added resellers and other companies that were depending on HashiCorp products. So there was a sense of betrayal, right? There's a sense of a rug pull, like, hey, you built this like bona fide open source community, or this open source community, trusted you, right? These folks trusted you, and now you've changed. Now you've switched. So there's this sense of betrayal. And yeah, I guess one message I want to get out there is it's not one size fits all. So Sentry is not HashiCorp. And I actually, I do want to bring this up. It was really interesting when I went and I looked at the numbers. So this on the screen share now is maybe not the best chart, but bear with me. This is some analysis I did. I went back to our main repo. It's a Django app, this monolith, Django monolith, Sentry. Get Sentry on GitHub. And did some analysis of the commit history, and I took the email addresses that you get in the commit log and I mapped them to founders. So David and Chris. Second bucket, there is employees or future employees. And then the third bucket is others, community members, trying to get a sense of, because there's always anecdotally, and again, I've only been here for 3 years, so I've been, a customer Sentry for much longer. There's always, it was sort of anecdotal that, Sentry, we've always built it ourselves, right? So I went and I did the homework, and it turns out that that's true. So what this is showing is breaking down 3 eras. So again, as I mentioned, 2008 we started, 2015 is when we incorporated and so we could take venture capital. And then 2019 is when we relicensed, as you mentioned, to BSL. And what I wanted to see was what was the impact of those 2 events on our contributor community, okay? And what this is showing then in this column, others, it's showing that before we incorporated, 6% of Sentry commits came from outside of the founders or first employees, okay? In other words, even before we incorporated, 90+% of Sentry was built by David Kramer, to be honest, David and Chris. Chris is our design founder, okay? Then what's interesting is, so 2 interesting things, right? So when we go from incorporation, side project to business, that has a significant impact on the contributor community. You can see that it goes from 6% to 3.5%. In other words, when you raise money and you have money and you can start paying people to work on the product, those people work on the product more than volunteers and people on the internet, right? So that's
presumably you hired some of them, I would imagine, right?
Exactly, that's my point.
Yeah. And that would steal some of those away too.
Yeah.
No. Actually, no, because employees here, you can see this 2.7% before incorporation. So those core contributors, they were core members of the project before we incorporated, and they became employees. So they're counted here as employees, even though we're not incorporated yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't take away from that 6%. So that 6% was folks, that didn't end up getting hired in. And let's see. But then the other interesting thing is that the BSL had pretty much no impact on outside contributions. You can see we went from 3.5% of contributors between incorporation 2015 and BSL in 2019. So that's when we were a BSD licensed product with a growing venture-backed startup behind it. 3.5% of our contributions came from outside the company. And since since 2019 we were licensed, it's 3.4%, right? The point is that hasn't changed. That's been consistent. So first of all,
and these are the number of commits, not the number of committers.
Let me see. So this is commits to the Sentry monolith by relation by era. Yes. So yes, this is the number of commits. There's 60,000 commits to Sentry of all time. Yeah. Now also Sentry's not we have our Django monolith. We've got 1,000+ repos. Our SDKs are a different story. That's true for a lot of companies. SDKs tend to be a place where you see a lot more community engagement. So we definitely have contractors and volunteers and longtime community members participating there in SDKs, and those are licensed MIT. So those are true open source license. But what I want to show here is that this narrative about the betrayal, the rug pull, you had this community, and then you're greedy venture capitalists, you closed, you closed it off. That's not really accurate for Sentry's case. It really is the case that we were always the ones that were building the software. And look, if you're motivated to hack on Sentry, we want to hire you. There's, I don't know. I feel that's that's where this conversation gets interesting, is like, how do we provision software? Again, going back to this idea of balancing start with user freedom, balancing user freedom with developer sustainability.
How has this impacted the adoption?
Like people using Sentry?
Yeah.
Specifically the license change in 2019?
Or even the recent. I mean, maybe it's too new for the recent, but yeah.
Yeah,
So let's say
the recent one. Well, and I guess to connect the dots, so the FSL is really an evolution of the BSL. Because the challenge with the BSL is that it has these fill in the blanks. It's parameterized. So there's this, it's template. Like, okay, you pick what you want your change date to be. Is it 4 years? That's the default. Sentry's been using 3 years. Other companies, are using longer. So that can change. The license it converts to can change. But most importantly, what's called the acceptable use grant can change. And so every BSL is essentially a unique license because of that, because every person that adopts BSL has to write their own acceptable use grant, and those vary wildly. So Sentry is
just to clarify,
yep.
Acceptable use grants are things like anybody but AviPress can use my software.
Correct. Right. So Matt, obviously that's what you're going to put in your acceptable use grant.
I have it in every license that
all
I
your
have
BSL
already.
License software.
Yes.
Right. So point is, what we were trying to do with the FSL was take the BSL and just fix some of its worst problems by essentially closing those holes, filling in the blanks, and what is it, convention over configuration or whatever. Remember that old Ruby on Rails? What aphorism? Yeah. So BSL, right, has these variabilities. FSL is only 2 years, so we cut it from 4 to 2 years because we thought, 4 years is a long time. 2 years is long enough. 4 years is a long time in software. If you have 4-year-old software, it's more than twice as old as 2-year-old software, if you will. So we cut it from 4 to 2 years, but it's only 2 years. And then there's only 2 change license options, Apache or MIT. And there's no acceptable use grant. So FSL is an evolution of BSL.
And was this really motivated by the purchase of CodeCove?
CodeCove,
the community there?
Yeah. Okay, so the story there then, right, we bought CodeCove probably about a year ago now, I think. CodeCove is this code coverage, pre-prod testing focused company, and closed source when we bought it. Sentry, we think of ourselves as an open source company, so of course we're going to open source the thing, the closed source thing that we bought, part of our company culture. And then when so we did a lot of work to get it ready to publish that code. When we did, we put the BSL on it, and we put out a blog post that said CodeCove is now open source. And we got some feedback from the community that they disagreed with us, that CodeCove they thought was not open source because it was under the BSL and not an OSI approved license. Okay. So we heard that feedback. The next day, David put up a post, apologizing and, saying, apologizing, backpedaling on that. And then that so that was late July, early August. I think August 2nd was the post, the CodeCove is now open source post. That is what began the process in earnest of, because FSL is really, it's an implementation detail. The bigger picture is, how do we balance user freedom with developer sustainability? We're not the first ones to have this problem. We're not going to be the last ones. This isn't the only way that this problem manifests. Open source, by definition, is susceptible to the free rider problem. Open source says anybody can do whatever they want with this. It creates this commons. It's a public good, and the mechanisms to fund the production of public goods are primarily taxes, to be honest. Like, that's the way that we fund things that are in the same bucket as open source. The second way that you fund things like that is through, it's really quasi-governmental, where it's like you get a bunch of people together and they sort of come up with their own agreements and social norms around funding and provisioning these things. And look, this is like well established, well outside of software. You know, there's a whole body of research on this, how to fund the commons. Governing the Commons is a major book in this. Gosh, how did I get off on that? You were asking about FSL. We're talking about BSL. We're talking about FSL.
Talking about adoption for a while. Yeah. So there
adoption.
Yeah.
So we have not. It certainly is too early to tell with FSL on adoption. But no, BSL is not slowed adoption for us. And actually, I'll say this: the way that we wrote the BSL and now the FSL, we wrote our version of BSL and now FSL. We are focused on SaaS commercialization, so we explicitly allow for self-hosted usage of Sentry. So that means all those folks that were self-hosting Sentry for years before BSL continue to be able to self-host Sentry. The restriction that we put on it is you can't do like GitLab wanted to do, or like AWS might want to do, or somebody else, which is offer a hosted version of Sentry, for a fee. That's what we limit. So that might have been the place where adoption would have suffered, but we specifically allow for self-hosting. So maybe that's a more direct answer to your question, Matt. Instead of going
yeah, and I think when I see this this breakdown of how how much outside contribution is coming into Sentry over these events, I think that one thing I'd really want to know with this is there's a couple things here. So one is that as the Sentry user base grows, how that's actually impacting, because if there's a lot more users and the contribution percentage is staying flat, that actually did harm contributions kind of materially, like depending on absolute as a portion of the code base versus how many, the percentage of your user base that is contributing as well, I think is kind of another variable here. And the other one that's, the other thing that I'll say here too is that percentage of commits also is totally up to you, right? Like you can accept or reject any given submission.
Sure, that's fair.
And so it could be the case, right, that like maybe Sentry had less ability to ingest, PRs because they're busy with other things or whatever that might look like. And so there's so many variables here. I feel like I'm immediately wanting to ask 6 different follow-up questions about this.
Well, so to take those two, this, I guess the second first, we certainly do not optimize for outside contributions to the Sentry monolith. Again, for the SDKs, it's a different story. And we do have some other like kind of generic, I'll say, projects, that are more traditional open source projects. But for the Sentry monolith itself, we don't optimize certainly for outside contributors. So like, it's a lot of work to set up a development environment for Sentry. You know what I mean? And we do occasionally get folks that go to the trouble and give us contributions, and we accept them when as much as we can. It's generally celebrated in the company, when somebody gives us an outside contribution. So, I mean, I'll let you do your own research and decide how conspiratorial we want to be about us, doing that to gain these numbers. But
not to imply you're gaming the numbers. I just mean that I'd be interested. It's a very interesting question.
It's a design choice, right? It's like, how do you want to run your project? Yeah. How do you want to run your company? Like, do you want to do like HashiCorp and build this big, vibrant community, or do you want to, like, Sentry was very explicit from the beginning. Like I said, David built most of Sentry himself for many years. And that was always kind of a design choice for the project and for the company, that no, we're not really like, because here's one thing I want to say, and I do want to get to your first point too, come back to that. But there's different kinds of software. A library, a left pad or a colored JS or a faker JS or whatever, or a log4j, right? Or a larger framework even. Like, there's different kinds of software. Lower level operating systems, frameworks, libraries, CLI tools, those are different than end user applications, kind of full product experiences. And what we're building with Sentry is a product. It's something that requires kind of a different level of what do I want to say? Like attention to detail, focus on user experience. Kind of the things that we sort of like naturally accept. Like Gmail has 1 billion users. Facebook has 1 billion users. You know what I mean? More, right? Like YouTube, and the product experiences we've come to expect as normal from that level of software, like world-class software. Like, we don't see. Okay. That's what Sentry is aiming for. Like that's what we're benchmarking ourselves against in terms of product development, product direction. We're trying to build a world-class software product. Okay. We're developers, so we want to do it openly. But in terms of accepting contributions from the outside, the challenge there is like we have a very opinionated product direction. So even for our customers, we've got like 80, 90,000 plus customers. Like we're building for tens of thousands of customers. So like big customer comes to us and says, "Hey, I need this feature to get this done." We're like, "Great, get in line." We're building for thousands of customers at a time, right? And so that mindset is very different than, again, it's design. It's like, what are you trying to do in the world? Are you trying to build a really amazing world-class software product, with the business to match it? Or are you trying to build a really vibrant volunteer community that, maybe doesn't have that economic layer in it? There's trade-offs.
And Chad, to follow up, just to clarify, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing you say is really, as Sentry was founded, it was done in the open source space to get feedback, to provide people confidence in it. It really wasn't there to garner large scale contributions and collaborate. It was more for, hey, we're going to start off. This is this cool thing, and let's make a business of it, and we'll do it in the open source space.
I mean, Kramer's a hacker, man. He's like out there, and again, it's like in the air. You just share your code, right? You put it on GitHub.
Yeah, and so and we've seen this with other folks, right? So Mongo, they've come out and said we never open sourced for the community. We didn't want contributions. Right. We did it because it was a marketing strategy. We did it because we wanted to have a, developer adoption. Right. So there were reasons for it that open source was just a means to an end, if you will.
So I'm going to go back to this open source values post that I put out. This was, I started writing this the day of the CodeCov kerfuffle, as I've come to call it, and published it a month later. So this went through a number of drafts. So this represents kind of our settled thinking on, because one of the pieces of feedback we got from the CodeCov kerfuffle, Adam Jacob was like, "Hey, why don't you guys tell us what your values are? Because open source values are user freedom, okay? The 4 freedoms, right? Like that's clear and settled. Like that's the philosophy behind open source, even though it's really rooted in free software. Why don't you try articulating what your values actually are, and then conversation can proceed from there." So that's what this post does. So this is a month after CodeCov, kind of, again, long backstory on the history and values, but that's where we get to balancing user freedom and developer sustainability. So, are there marketing benefits from being open source? Yes, of course. It's like the most powerful brand in the software world, right? Are there, adoption benefits because developers, can see and trust the code more? Yes, of course. And what we talk about in here is there's a focus on, let me find it. Yeah, here you go. We think of freedom primarily in terms of access to technology and knowledge to improve efficiency for developers. So, this is where we get to like a little more altruistic, and the motivations are mixed or whatever. We're a company, but a company of people, we can assume good intentions here, right? Like we're developers. We want to share our code with other people, and we want to see other people's code. We don't want to, waste time having to reinvent wheels if we can go learn from something else without stealing it whole hog or whatever, you know what I mean? So like, there is yes, you can take the cynical view that it's just marketing or something, but I would try to balance that with like, we are developers that love geeking out with other developers on stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that, don't I don't have a problem with you licensing or any company licensing on something that is, towards their values. I think where the open source community tends to get more, not necessarily even upset or more passionate, is one of the tenets has always been around open source non-discrimination. That's like one of the core tenets.
Yeah, sure.
And we've had many guests
right?
on here. Yeah. We've had many guests on the podcast where that comes up. Because we've talked about the BSL before. We've talked about the SSPL probably a dozen times at least, right, Avi?
Half of the episodes.
Yeah, half the episodes probably, have talked about this. And when we talk with the folks who, are from either the OSI or from that community, it's really about that one that they're like, hey, we don't care if you're SSPL or BSL. We just care that you call that open source because it violates that. And, and it's a good point because we've had some discussions with folks who have been part of early discussions before some of these licenses were launched. And we've had people who have developed the original licenses and were part of OSI who have come out and said, this is a great license, whatever, but just don't call it open. And I think where this really started to get a hot button was with Elastic, right?
Yeah.
So when Elastic made the change, their whole thing was maybe a little similar to maybe the faux pas with, calling it open source when CodeCov. But Elastic came out and said, we're doubling down on open.
Yeah.
And so everyone just went, what the heck is that? Right.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably the lightning rod for a lot of that controversy.
Yeah.
And I think that's just something that, a lot of passionate developers who have invested a lot of time, money, and resources into open source and who bleed open source through and through. They look at this and they're like, that is what I believe in.
Yeah, I think the frame of reference with some of this stuff is also really important too, where, if you say we're going to, we're really committed to this very particular thing and we're going to take one step to the right of it, saying that we're doubling down on that thing, open source, versus we were having to make a decision between moving to a fully closed source proprietary thing, and this was the best set of compromises that we came up with. The exact same action, very different framing. And I think, will probably be received very different. And I think the way that, the marketing and the messaging around these kinds of changes are just so crucially important. I'm curious. So, with this initiative to roll out this new license, is it your goal to have other companies in this space adopt this license as well?
100%. Yeah, 100%. So we have one other product already, Answer Overflow. Shout out Answer Overflow. Adopted the FSL, in the first week or whatever after we announced it. I think so it's December 21st. Today we're recording this call. FSL was announced November 17th, if I remember right. So it's been about a month. We get into the holidays and slow down here. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'll be working on next year is, spreading the word and talking to folks for whom it's a good fit. It's not the right fit for everybody. It's really designed for SaaS companies that have an open source affinity or whatever we want to say, that want to because you're absolutely right about the framing, Avi. It's like, again, Gmail is not open source. YouTube's not open source. Facebook is not open source. They're not even source available, right? And we're not talking about that. Nobody's like, hey, why isn't, hey, Google, why isn't Google search, open source? It's like, I think you're right about the framing, but why are companies like Sentry and Elastic, in a sense, getting punished for trying to do something that's, I think, better than what we see, from companies that are, or maybe not, I don't know, maybe we don't care. But I think the point is we haven't seen, to date, open source is Linux, it's Apache Web Server, it's these lower level projects. Name name an end user product that anybody that's not in tech knows about and uses and has on their phone that's truly open source. I mean,
well, it's a matter of framing, or sorry, a matter of expectations, right? Like Google makes they don't talk about open source, so no one's up in arms.
But then you have to
that
get back into the why do we care about open source in the first place? Right? Why do we care about open source? Like and this was actually part of this values post. It's like all of the philosophical background for open source comes from Richard Stallman from Free Software Foundation. I did this whole analysis where I went and looked at the 200 plus articles under /philosophy, under New Org /philosophy, and like read all those articles and analyzed them. There's nothing on open source org that's like, here's the why behind open source. So I think some of if I want to push back on this a little bit, it feels like, obviously, yes, there is a very passionate community of folks that see the definition, the open source definition, that see the free software for freedoms, and if a license doesn't meet that, push back on the use of that term. Okay, and now with CodeCov, like again, we apologize the next day, and we're trying to be good faith participants in this conversation. At the same time, like, why do we care so much about those definitions? And what's the downside? And that's where we get into the developer sustainability thing, right? Like, there's a sustainability crisis in open source. This is Log4j, this is Heartbleed, this is the XKCD, whatever the number is, with the one guy in Nebraska. Like, this is Roads and Bridges report. There's different parts of the community. There's companies that commercialize open source. There's non-commercial open source projects that don't want money. Okay. I mean, this is like the DHH Rails thing. He's like, I want to keep them separate. Like, don't bring money into open source. So there's that component, but then there's this significant component in the middle, which is, we need to come up with the right word for it, but like sponsorable, what I mean? Like,
yeah. And again, I'm not trying to pick on you, Chad. Please don't feel like we are here to pick on you, Chad. We are not
corporate venture-backed.
Yeah. No.
Me too.
No,
it's
because
all good. Me too.
Here's my philosophy is that, open source has become, kind of ubiquitous with a lot of software development because there's a lot of great stuff about it. But it is not necessarily for every project. And as you're saying, with SaaS projects, a lot of the open source stuff wasn't designed even with that as in mind, because it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And so as we start to look at, hey, we want to take these 5 things and we want to invent something new. And that's why I do really appreciate you coming out and saying, like, hey, we heard this comment from what was it, the founder of Chef, right? Who was like, call it yourself on your own values. And I think that's beautiful, right? Because
super agree.
What it does is it says, like, we do value this stuff, but we recognize that this one tenet is causing us, it's preventing us from, creating a commercially viable product and building a sustainable ecosystem.
Here's a ticket. Sorry. Finish it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is a fine way to do it, right? I do.
This ticket here that I've got up on the screen is in our repo for FSL.software. And this is before we launched. Dan Brown came in and asked explicitly this question: how will open source be used or framed relative to this license or plan? So, whereas with CodeCov, we got this feedback after the fact. One of the wonderful things about FSL is we had this conversation before we launched FSL. So we actually went back and forth in this thread, and Jordan Harband's in here, and like we went back and forth, and we reached an agreeable conclusion, so that the FSL website, really only mentions open source very briefly, just to say we, kind of distinguish ourselves from it, right? So I think I see this as kind of the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of hopefully the convergence of a conversation. Because I think one of the things we're seeing is like you said, Elastic, Maria, MongoDB, like We're not the first ones. And honestly, you can go way back. Do you remember the shared source initiative?
Yeah.
From Microsoft, right?
Yeah.
Like 2 years after open source came out, Microsoft came out with the shared source initiative, which, I don't think they've updated the website since. This is very old, but it's still there. And this is in some ways wrestling with the same sort of things. Like, how do you have companies that have a need to make money, which comes from scarcity, which comes from restriction, which comes from discriminating, to use that term, the technical term from the open source definition. How do you balance that with user freedom? So it's been an ongoing conversation the whole life of open source. And I think our ideal at Sentry would be to see some convergence around some practical answers, like the license proliferation that we've seen. Certainly, it kind of like parallels what we saw in free software and open source. Like you have this license proliferation, but then the community kind of settles on a handful of, half dozen licenses that are kind of the main ones that we see in open source. Our expectation and kind of what we're sort of looking for is like, can we find that same, like, well, here's 2 or 3, and again, we need to find the name for it because source available is too broad, but 2 or 3 kind of source available non-compete licenses that fit under this sustainable source brand or whatever we're going to come up with. That people can know what it means and know what it stands for and know what to expect. And then, I do want to slip in this plug because being a successful company that does value the wider open source community, it's very important to us to fund that component in the middle of non-commercial projects that want to be sponsored. Okay, so you got the commercial projects like Sentry, you've got the non-commercial projects that don't want any money, but then there is a significant number of developers that are putting open source out there. Their open source libraries and whatnot are getting picked up by companies that make a lot of money off of them. And yeah, at Sentry, we firmly believe in funding, giving money to the open source maintainers that want it. And we think that's an important kind of corollary. Like it goes hand in hand. Like we think about it, think about it.
And you've done a lot of funding in that space, right?
Dude, let's do it. Yeah. So let me go here. So that was last year's. So here's our blog post from a few months ago. It's like a month before the FSL went out. So we gave $500,000 last year to open source maintainers, which for a company Sentry size is significant.
Really great.
This is
really
$3,700 per engineer at Sentry for the year. That'll be a different episode. We can go down that rabbit hole, but I did want to kind of, for us, we think about it's all under this heading of sustainability, right? The FSL license is our tool that we use to maintain our sustainability ourselves. And because we're a successful business, we're able to turn around and give money voluntarily to that portion of the open source community. And this is where I push back on well, just don't call it open source. It's like, we're part of the open source community. It's one community. And so why is, one of the things we talk about internally and get frustrated at is why is a company like GitLab or whatever open core? Why is open core considered more legitimate than what we're doing? You're sharing less, but because it feels like it's this nitpicky technicality that it's but they didn't use the license and they didn't call it, but it's there's a bigger picture here, which is that we're all humans trying to do stuff together and we should take care of each other. And one of the ways that works is we charge you for our product and you give us money. Okay. And we give you a good product. But then excuse me, I'm hitting my mic, get so excited. That enables us to turn around.
Get not here.
No, but for us, we love all these open source developers that are building all this stuff, and we think it sucks that they're not funded, right? And it doesn't feel right to us that it's well, don't call yourselves open source. It's well, actually, we want to be part of the open source community. Us giving money to open source, technically open source free software, us giving money to that is part of our open source commitment. I don't know. Let me climb the box here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Ahead,
Matt. I want to address, because you mentioned how is open core different. Let me give you my 2 cents on that, because
Sure.
I think that's a good differentiator. It's dual licensed. That's really where it boils down to is, you want this set of features, you want this piece of software that is
Yeah.
open core. It is not open source. Like,
Yes.
it-
So
I
that's
come from
less open source than FSL.
but there is a pure open source version that you can go do those things with. MySQL, I used to work at MySQL IB, just an FYI.
There you go.
So hey, enterprise version, non-enterprise version. Guess what? Amazon uses the non-enterprise version. Everybody uses MySQL non-enterprise version, but there is an enterprise licensed version that has other stuff or things that you can't get in the open source space. And I think that is, you could say, it's not different than what you're doing. And I would agree with that, because what you're saying is, hey, there's this restriction here, but that restriction is in that kind of like dual license side, where it's like this subset of things is not licensed in the open. This subset is. And so this subset is free. And that's where,
So we're saying we're more open source than open core companies. We're saying we're more open source than GPL software, because GPL has its own, like you can argue GPL is putting its own restrictions on you.
And
right?
I would.
I don't know. But the main point I want to make is like open source is bigger than licensing. Open source is people, and there's a huge chunk of people in the community that are saying, hey, I could really use a few bucks from you guys that are making billions of dollars off of the software that I wrote. And we think that matters, and we think that's part of the open source conversation. And if we only focus on the technicalities of the licensing to the exclusion of that, then we're not talking about the full picture of open source. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very great point. And one thing that I've said on this podcast before is that I feel like we need to have better ways of talking about kind of the nuanced differences between kind of the very strict criteria that we've, set out with the OSD versus things that deviate from it in, many different dimensions to many different degrees. And so one thing to tie back to something earlier that you said with that is that it does feel sometimes that we in the open source community do like penalize exploration within that, I would much rather a company try to commit to pure open source than find that doesn't work and try to find the right compromises versus just start out assuming that it's going to fail and you just go for something fully proprietary. And so I feel like I would want to say that I very much commend that effort of trying to do that exploration, try things and see how people are going to react. And hopefully we will land at something that, finds the right set of compromises here that people are happy with and, finds the right, path forward for all of these companies. So that's where, my 2 cents on this stuff comes in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I started doing open source in 2001. So, a couple years after the term was coined. So I've certainly spent my career in open source, thinking of myself as working in open source, putting out open source software. And it doesn't sit entirely right with me to go start a thing over here that's like, okay, so now I'm not open source anymore. Like I want to hold off on that a little bit and be like, isn't there some way that we could have like open source blank or some like, open source here's something we talk about, the concept, it's bandied about, the concept of an open source company. Okay. Like what if there was some definition that, arose in the community that like worked its way through that was like, here are the criteria you need to meet to be an open source company. And like, what if like a handful of licenses like the FSL were part of that, and also some commitment, some like pledge to giving, to sharing money back to, those non-commercial projects, something like that. Like, is it like, does it need to be a hard fork here? I guess is what I'm saying. Like, is it a hard fork between the open source community and the sustainable source community or whatever? Like,
I hope not.
What's the relation
Personally,
between
I
the
hope
two?
not. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
and so this is where, I mean, like, quite honestly, I think we get so worked up about the term or the descriptor that we feel like it is incredibly important to have it no matter what we're doing, because it reflects on like what we're comfortable with as, and I'm not just saying Chad, I'm not picking on you. I'm saying as a community as a whole,
Okay.
like there are projects and stuff where we look at the term open source, and there really, isn't an open source company. There are companies that do open source, right? And I can guarantee you, Chad, even if you use the FSL, you are, as a company at Sentry, are doing open source. You contribute to other projects. You work on things that are in the open source space. I'm guessing some of your SDKs probably aren't FSL. They're probably open.
No, yeah, SDKs are all MIT. We've got Symbolicator. We've got
right.
Responder, we've got different projects.
So you are working on and developing open source, right? And it's the same thing when you talk about Mongo, when you talk about Maria. There are it's not an open source company, and because
why not, Matt? Why not? What is an open source company? What's the definition of an open source company?
There are zero.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Why not?
Chad's side here.
Why not?
There are zero.
Why?
You commercialize open source. If you are commercializing
hour, you guys.
Companies who will do open source, right?
Again?
It's a term that we like to apply because it's buzzworthy.
Yeah, open
Right?
source.
No,
is not
it has a
business
very
model.
particular meaning here. Like if you commercialize open source, if you do a lot of
Then
open
you're a
source,
company that does open source.
but it's much easier to say open source company.
Yeah,
Well, it might be
what's wrong?
easier. You might want to, but I'm just saying. Like, I think
You're just saying what? You're just saying what? It's wrong. It's
like
wrong.
when
We're
you
not.
say
There's
when
a
you say
definition
you're-
of open source company. We don't fit it.
Well, no,
Why
like,
not, man?
okay,
Words mean
when
what
I-
we want them to mean. If we want there to be a thing called open source companies,
like,
we can have a
No,
thing.
no,
Open
no,
source is not
because-
a business model. Okay. Well, show me
it's
some.
like- it's okay. Like, look, like it's like me saying, like, okay, if I've got one product that's open source and everything else is proprietary,
Okay.
I'm not an open source company. I'm a company that does open source, and that's cool. I mean, there's not a problem with that, right? I mean, you look at Google, and we picked on Google earlier. Google is one of the bigger contributors to the open source space. They have more open source projects than most other companies. Are they an open source company? Why
No.
not?
I don't know. I'm not
Why not?
sure.
They're not because they're first of all because they're
They write more code than I've ever written, and more code in the open source space than any other company I've been associated with.
because their core products are not under open source adjacent licenses, and because their financial contribution to their dependencies doesn't meet a certain threshold. That would be my answer to why not.
I would imagine that
we
they
could-
do. I would imagine
No.
that they
Nope.
contribute a lot.
No,
Microsoft as well. Like, you can make that
so,
argument now.
Look, with all due respect to my friends at Microsoft and Google, Google's number for last year. Am I going to say this live? It's public information. I'd have
If you
to dig
want,
up the
we can
blog
cut it
post.
out.
5.7 million. They gave 5.7 million to open source projects last year. Okay. Divide that by the number of developers at Google, right? Which is like 25 to 50,000. I don't know what they're at, but it comes out to like, well, what's the math? It's like,
But Go and Kubernetes and all these things, like, they
now
also
that's separate.
contribute.
Now that's
a lot.
separate,
Yeah.
right? That's them, and that needs to be accounted for, absolutely. And same with Microsoft. It's like the projects that you're putting out there. But again, and this is what I think that we need here. I think that it's worth doing the hard work of getting into these details. Of
Yes.
saying,
Yes.
what are the
Yes.
things that
No,
matter?
no, I
Like,
completely agree.
the financial, the money that you donate, the time, the time, the FTEs, right? Like the developer time that you put on projects, et cetera, right? Like, and the licensing of your own, those would really be the three, right?
Yeah.
Time, money, and licensing of your core products. I think core products is crucial. Core products. If you're going to be an open source company, like, your core product has to be under, and this is why we haven't had to worry about this, because like Linux hasn't been anybody's core product. Okay, that's false.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been like one company's core product in the sense that Sentry is Sentry's core product. There was a GitHub,
Red
a
Hat,
post on
I guess,
GitHub's
but
blog. I forget the name of the person
canonical.
that wrote it, that used the term single source, a single source product or a single source project that, basically controlled by one company. So Sentry is an example of this. But yeah, okay. So I think it's worth getting into these details. I don't know how long you guys have today.
I can keep going a little bit longer, Matt, if you can. But
probably start to wind this down and.
So we do have to go. I mean, and so what we've decided is I'm right. Always.
Yeah. I mean, it's in the acceptable use grant, right?
Yes, it's in my license.
We signed up. Yeah,
it's in my license. And Chad, I've actually given a few talks on this because I understand the funding problem. I gave a talk just at the Community Over Code Conference, which is the former Apache conference, about sustainability and why asking for money shouldn't make open source people feel slimy. So if you go check out, I think it's on YouTube or archive.org or whatever.
Good talk.
But there are a lot of companies who do struggle, and a lot of projects that do struggle to make ends meet. And there has to be ways that they can work within the confines of the current ecosystem. And I'm all for new licenses, new business models, new things that we explore. I think that the SaaS model has really revolutionized quite a bit. And I think it's something that is going to continue to change how we think about software and, how software's consumed. So, I mean, there's going to be changes in the next few years, and there has to be, because there's so many projects out there that do need funding to survive and continue.
All right. So my homework for next time is to watch that talk.
Watch the talk.
We'll have to. We'll definitely have to have you back on, because I feel like there's a whole lot that we could get into that we did. We could go for hours, I think. But I think one thing that really sticks out to me with this conversation. It is my hope in the open source community that when we're looking at trying to improve various things across the board, that we really start to highlight more where we agree than where we disagree. And I think that in these conversations with source open source adjacent licenses, we really focus on the differences quite a bit, where I think there's a lot more that we all agree on than what we disagree on. And so that's my ask for the open source community when we start to talk about this particular topic. And I hope that all these efforts with the FSL continue to lead to more fruitful discussions and healthier companies and healthier projects.
+1. Thank you.
Well, with that, let us wrap up. Chad, thank you for coming on. We hope that you don't feel too upset about getting beat up, and having a rousing debate, which is what we love to do in the open source community anyways.
Yeah, no, that was great.
Thanks so much.
It's really good. Glad we could do this. Way easier to do this here than other channels and social media and whatnot. So good talking to you guys.
All right. Totally. We appreciate you hanging out. Don't forget, everybody, like, subscribe, follow us on all of the socials.